Why did God allow the Nephilim giants to rule for 1,656 years? The shocking biblical truth. What if the most terrifying creatures mentioned in the Bible were not defeated by an army, but by a judgment from God? For centuries, ancient traditions have spoken about giants who dominated the ancient world, powerful beings connected to the mysterious Nephilim of Genesis 6. Some modern interpretations even claim that these giants ruled for 1,656 years. But here's the question that is far more disturbing. If God saw what was happening, why did he allow it to continue for so long? Why didn't God destroy them immediately? Why did he allow a world filled with violence, corruption, and mysterious giants to continue? And perhaps most importantly, what was God actually doing while the Nephilim appeared to dominate the earth? The answer begins with one of the strangest passages in the entire Bible, Genesis 6. And what it reveals is far more serious than a story about giants. Imagine a world where violence had become normal. Humanity was multiplying across the earth. Cities were developing. Families were growing. Civilization was expanding. But beneath the surface, something was going terribly wrong. Genesis 6 tells us that the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took wives from among them. Then comes the mysterious statement, there were giants in the earth in those days. The Hebrew text calls them Nephilim, and the passage describes them as mighty men who were renowned in ancient times. But don't make the mistake of thinking the Bible is simply telling us about unusually tall people. The Nephilim appear inside a much larger story, a story about rebellion, a story about corruption, a story about humanity's descent into violence, and ultimately, a story about God's judgment. Genesis 6:5 gives us the terrifying context. God saw that the wickedness of humanity had become great on the earth, and the thoughts of the human heart were continually evil. That is when the story changes, because the real threat wasn't simply the existence of giants. The real threat was a world becoming increasingly corrupted. But who exactly were the Nephilim? This is where we need to slow down. The Bible does not give us every answer, and that matters. There are different interpretations of Genesis 6. Some understand the sons of God as rebellious heavenly beings. Others understand them as human rulers or descendants of Seth. And throughout Jewish and Christian history, the passage has generated enormous debate. Later Jewish writings, including the Book of Enoch, expand dramatically on the story of the Watchers and their interaction with humanity. But those later writings should not be treated as though every detail appears directly in Genesis. Genesis itself gives us something much more restrained and much more terrifying. It tells us that the Nephilim were present in those days. It tells us that powerful figures existed. And it tells us that humanity had become deeply violent and corrupt. Then Scripture says something that changes everything. God saw it. Nothing was hidden from him. Not the violence, not the corruption, not the rebellion, not the suffering. God saw everything. So why did he wait? This is where the question becomes deeper. If God is all-powerful, why didn't he simply erase the Nephilim the moment they appeared? Why allow generations to pass? Why allow violence to spread? Why allow humanity to continue? The answer begins with something we often overlook. God's patience is not God's weakness. The fact that judgment does not happen immediately does not mean God has lost control. Throughout Scripture, God repeatedly gives people time before judgment. He warns, he waits, he calls people to turn back, and then, when judgment comes, it comes according to his purpose. The flood is the clearest example. God didn't suddenly discover that humanity had become wicked. Genesis says that God saw the condition of the earth. The judgment was deliberate, and Noah was given a mission. Build the ark. Prepare. Warn. Wait. The world continued, until the day the waters came. But now we have to confront the number in our title. 656 years. Did the Bible say the Nephilim ruled for 1,656 years? No. There is no verse in Genesis that gives that exact figure. So where does this number come from? It belongs to a chronological interpretation used in modern discussions and documentary-style presentations about the giants. That distinction is important, because if we're making a Bible documentary, we shouldn't present a calculation or later interpretation as though it were a direct quotation from Scripture. But the number does raise an interesting question. Even if we set the exact figure aside, Why does the biblical story allow the Nephilim tradition to stretch across such a vast period of ancient history? And that brings us to one of the most fascinating clues. Because the story of giants doesn't simply disappear after Genesis 6. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. When you hear the word Nephilim, what do you think they were? A. Fallen angels and their offspring? B. Powerful human warriors? C. Something else entirely? Write your answer in the comments. And if you enjoy Bible mysteries where we separate what Scripture actually says from later traditions, subscribe to Bible Truth Revealed. Because what happens to the giant traditions after the flood is where this story becomes even more fascinating. Here's the part many people miss. The flood narrative doesn't end every reference to giants. Much later, when Israel reaches the edge of the Promised Land, the spies report seeing powerful inhabitants. Numbers 13 contains one of the most famous descriptions. The spies say they saw the descendants of Anak, and they describe themselves as grasshoppers in comparison. This is where fear takes over. Imagine the psychological impact. Israel had witnessed God's power. They had seen Egypt defeated. They had crossed the Red Sea. They had watched God provide for them. And yet, when they saw enormous warriors in the land, they became terrified. Their problem wasn't simply the size of their enemies. Their problem was that they had forgotten the size of their God. Joshua and Caleb saw the same giants, but they responded differently. They believed God could give Israel the land. That is one of the Bible's recurring themes. Faith sees God's power before it sees the size of the obstacle. And then we encounter another famous giant, Goliath. He stands before the armies of Israel and challenges them, day after day. No soldier wants to face him. He is armed. He is experienced. He is intimidating. And then a shepherd boy arrives. David doesn't look like a warrior. He doesn't have the armor. He doesn't carry a massive sword. But David understands something Goliath does not. The battle isn't ultimately about human strength. David declares that the battle belongs to the Lord. And then, one stone, one sling, one giant falls. Think about what this means for the larger biblical story. The Bible repeatedly presents seemingly unstoppable giants, and then shows that they are not unstoppable. The Nephilim, the Anakim, the Rephaim traditions, Goliath. Again and again, enormous human strength is placed beside the power of God. And the message remains the same. What looks invincible to humanity is never invincible to God. Now we can return to our original question. Why would God allow such darkness to continue? Why allow generations to pass? Why not destroy everything immediately? Because the Bible's story is not primarily about how long evil survives. It is about who remains sovereign while evil survives. The Nephilim were not ruling outside God's knowledge. They were not overpowering God. They were not hiding from Him. And they were certainly not immortal kings who had escaped divine authority. The flood proves that. God eventually judged the world, and the giants of later generations were eventually confronted as well. The Bible never presents them as the final rulers of history. God is. That changes the entire meaning of the story. The question isn't, why were the giants so powerful?
They are close.
The deeper question is, why did God allow evil to continue until His appointed time? And Scripture repeatedly gives us the same answer. Because God's timing is not controlled by human fear. Now look again at Genesis 6. The most shocking sentence isn't actually, "There were giants." It's what comes immediately around it. Human wickedness had become great. Violence had filled the earth. And the human heart had become corrupted. That's the real reason the flood comes. The Bible isn't giving us a monster movie. It is giving us a warning about what happens when humanity turns away from God. The Nephilim are part of a much bigger picture. And that distinction matters. Because if we focus only on giant bodies, enormous weapons, mysterious bloodlines, and ancient legends, we can miss the central biblical message. Sin had become the real giant, and humanity could not defeat it through human strength. Then comes Noah. While the world is moving deeper into corruption, one man is described as walking with God. God tells Noah to build an ark. Not because Noah is stronger than everyone else. Not because Noah has an army. Not because he can defeat the giants. But because Noah trusts God. The ark becomes a picture of God's provision in the middle of judgment. And when the flood comes, the world that seemed unstoppable suddenly changes. The violence stops. The ancient world disappears beneath the waters. And Noah emerges into a new beginning. That is the biblical pattern. God sees the corruption. God gives warning. God provides a way of escape. God judges evil. God preserves those who trust Him. And then, God begins again. So what is the shocking biblical truth about the Nephilim? It isn't that they ruled for a certain number of years. It isn't that they were too powerful for ordinary humans. And it isn't that ancient giants somehow escaped God's authority. The shocking truth is this: even when evil appears to dominate for generations, it never becomes sovereign. The giants may have appeared powerful. Violent kingdoms may have appeared unstoppable. Entire generations may have lived under corruption. But God was never absent. He was watching. He was judging. He was preserving. And He was moving history toward His appointed purpose. That is why the story of the Nephilim is ultimately not a story about giants. It is a story about the limits of human power and the absolute sovereignty of God. And perhaps that's why this ancient story still matters. Because we live in a world where evil can sometimes look enormous. Corruption can look unstoppable. Violence can look permanent. Problems can look too large to defeat. And sometimes we look at the world and ask, God, why are you allowing this? The story of the Nephilim reminds us that God's silence is not surrender. His patience is not weakness. And His delay is not defeat. There are battles whose timing we don't understand. There are judgments we cannot see coming. And there are purposes of God that unfold long after human beings assume nothing is happening. The giants were never the final authority. God was. And He still is. So the next time you hear the story of the Nephilim, don't only ask, how big were the giants? Ask the bigger question, how powerful is the God who watched them rise, and ultimately brought their world to an end? Because Scripture gives us a warning. Human strength has limits. Empires have limits. Giants have limits. But God's authority has no limit. If this story made you see the Nephilim differently, comment "God is sovereign" below. And subscribe to Bible Truth Revealed for more hidden Bible mysteries, ancient biblical history, and truths most people never hear explained. The giants may have looked unstoppable, but they were never in control.